From the Daily Catch, this is The Catch Up, and I'm Emily Sachar. This episode of The Catch Up is brought to you by Hudson Solar and Battery Solutions, your local experts in energy independence. In Red Hook, Rhinebeck, and across the Hudson Valley, Hudson Solar Solutions helps homeowners and small businesses become more resilient. The only way to truly lower your electric costs is to reduce what you use or to generate your own power. Hudson Solar Solutions designs premium solar and battery systems built to do exactly that, safely and reliably. Visit hudsonsolarsolutions.com to see what energy independence looks like. This week, we turn to a shakeup in Red Hook Village politics, where two political newcomers, Perry Allen and Craig Rothstein, last week won seats on the village board, unseating incumbent Anthony Maccarini and filling a seat vacated by Amy Smythe in a closely watched election. Allen secured his seat outright, while Rothstein edged past Maccarini by just 18 votes, a margin narrow enough to trigger a review under state law. Both candidates campaigned on a familiar and urgent theme in Red Hook: rebuilding public trust, particularly around the village's troubled wastewater treatment plant. We'll talk about what their victory signals, what comes next with the recount, and how these new trustees may shape decisions on some of the village's most pressing issues. And we'll discuss the board's approval Monday of a zoning study focused on the northeast quadrant of the village, a move that could influence future development and land use in a significant way for many years to come. It's the week of March 23rd, and I'm very excited to welcome our Red Hook beat reporter, Athan Yanos, to the show for the very first time. Athan, welcome to the catch-up.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start at the beginning, Athan. Why were there two open seats on the Red Hook Village Board in the first place? What led to those vacancies?
Yeah, so to fully answer this question, we have to go back to early 2025. In January of 2025, former village trustee Stephen Appenzeller, whose term was supposed to end in April 2027, announced he would be moving out of the village of Red Hook and thereby resigning his seat. This vacancy was created too late to add to the 2025 election ballot, so it became the responsibility of the mayor at the time to appoint someone to his seat until it could be decided in the 2026 election. That seat was ultimately filled by Amy Smythe, who decided not to run for election in 2026, but that's how the first vacancy was filled. The second vacancy was created by another midterm resignation, this time in May 2025 by Kim Bradley Ricard, who resigned over concerns about transparency and interboard communication. As with the earlier vacancy, the mayor appointed a replacement to serve until the 2026 election, and the mayor slated Anthony Maccarini to fill Ricard's seat. He ran to continue his seat in March, but ultimately lost to newcomers Craig Rothstein and Perry Allen.
Got it. So had Amy Smythe decided to run for that seat, she would have been in the mix again, but she would have had to have run, and Maccarini did have to run too. So they had to run again.
They both had to run because they were not elected to their seats. They were appointed. And it's worth noting that both Perry Allen and Craig Rothstein will only be elected to one-year terms because they were elected not to a full trustee term, but rather to fill out the terms of Bradley Ricard, and...
Got it. Makes sense. Okay, perfect. So for listeners who may not know the players, who were the three candidates in this race? I guess one of them you just said was Maccarini trying to hold on to his seat. Tell us about the others.
So I know we're going to get into more of their specific policy decisions later, but just really quickly, we have Perry Allen, who's a Bard graduate originally from Phoenix, who currently works as a gigging musician. Then we have Craig Rothstein, who's a former journalist, pharmaceutical copywriter, and now is an inspiring academic. He just got his PhD at the end of last year and is hoping to get a full-time job in academia. His wife, Rebecca Rothstein, also owns Little Pickle's shop in the village, which is a favorite by many residents. And then we have trustee Anthony Maccarini, who, as we talked about, was appointed in August, and he is a private practice attorney specializing in family and matrimonial law in Carmel, which is in Putnam County.
Got it. Okay, so you said Perry Allen finished first. Let's take him first then. What do we know about him and what seemed to resonate with voters?
Yeah, so it's worth pointing out that Perry Allen ran the most quote unquote professional campaign out of the three. He did the most heavy canvassing. In January, he put out a press release announcing his candidacy. In late February, he put out another campaign memo detailing his takeaways from knocking on nearly 300 doors. And as I said, he was really the only candidate that went out to speak to voters where they were and made a conscious effort to find out what issues they care about and speak to them and speak on behalf of his candidacy. It's also worth noting that he was the most blunt out of the three candidates in his assessment of the current board, which I think a lot of voters appreciated. I pulled some quotes from his press releases, which I think are worth sharing. One, there is intense distrust between much of the public and the board. And this next quote is in regards to the sewer system. The current system does not function and is quickly becoming unaffordable for many. And then he said, excessive stoplight traffic and speeding through neighborhood streets. Are our children safe walking about? And these are all things that I was hearing from voters when I was talking to them at the polls on election day. And so I think Perry Allen did a really good job of convincing voters that he understood what they cared about and was one of them, so to speak.
We actually have some of those audios, which we'll play now for our listeners.
There are a couple issues I care about the most. One is the safety with the traffic and the pedestrians. I feel that's very important and that it's definitely changed since I've been here over the last 5 years. So I'd like to see what they're going to do about that issue, as well as the sewer and the communication. I know a lot of people that live over on the street where the sewer affects them. And so I want to make sure that they're taken care of and that the issue is addressed and communicated.
The big issue for me is the sewer system in the village and making sure that system is working properly and it's not polluting the water. And I've lived near there, and a number of people I know have got pneumonia. So that's a really big issue for me.
And we're very concerned about the troubles we're having with the sewage system. So that's what we're up to.
Also, I'm concerned about the transparency of decisions and how they're made. And I want to have more communication between the people in the district, in the village, and the trustees.
Well, I'm very interested in the sewage issue, specifically the extra discharge. And we've just hired a new people to take care of that. And the problem still seems to be persisting. So I'd really like that to be a focus and get cleaned up as soon as possible.
I think no matter who wins, they've all talked about the open communication changes that they want to make and some of the shortcomings maybe that has been there recently or
room
in the
for
last
improvement.
room for improvement. That's a better way to say it.
The other thing I want to say is, although this is the first time Perry Allen ran for a political position, he does have a track record of being involved in the community inside and outside the village. So when he was living in Phoenix, he helped design a new 11,000 square foot community park. And then when he moved back to Red Hook, he founded the now renamed Public Spaces Committee, which works to foster the development of public parks, art, and community spaces in the village. And that was entirely his initiative. He also wrote the grant that allowed the Red Hook Public Library to develop a pollinator garden, which should bloom and be beautiful in May. And then it's also worth noting that his wife, Bailey Williams, is the vice president of the Red Hook Community Center Board of Directors, and his sister-in-law, Savannah Lucas Sanchez, ran in the 2025 election. So even though this is his first electoral campaign, he's been involved in the village and getting things done. And I think voters recognized that and appreciated it.
Awesome. That's a really good summary of his background. Thank you. And Craig Rothstein narrowly edged out Maccarini. How close was this race, Athan? And do we expect the recount to uphold the first result?
Yeah, so as you mentioned at the top, the unofficial results showed Rothstein with 84 votes to Maccarini's 68 votes. That's a 16-vote margin, which is under the 20-vote margin required under New York State law for a recount by the Dutchess County Board of Elections. Now, this recount actually was completed last week. So the official results are Rothstein with 85 votes, Maccarini with 68 votes, and Perry Allen with 128 votes. So that is official, and those are the official results. I do want to mention briefly that we don't know exactly how many people turned out to vote, but if we take all of the votes and assume that everybody voted for two candidates, which is the maximum they were allowed to, it would be about 150 people turning out to vote. The village population is a little over 2,000 people, but if you take just 2,000, that's roughly 7.5% of the people that live in the village that voted. Now, not everybody that lives in the village is able to vote in the election because there's kids, but I do think it's worth pointing out that even though these election results are indicative of people having mass support for Perry and then preferring Craig over Tony or Anthony Maccarini, there's still probably a lot of people in the village that we didn't get to hear from and didn't make their voices known.
I noticed there were some comments, or at least one strong comment about that very fact on your election story last week from someone who said, interesting that so many people, or I should say, interesting that candidates emphasized so heavily trust in government. And this is a moment when voters could come out and cast a ballot to try to improve that situation if they so wanted, but many opted not to do so.
100%. And, a 7.5% voter turnout in any other national, global, state election would be remarkably low. And that would be the story we would be talking about.
But we do want to clarify that this is not the percentage of registered voters who voted.
Exactly. It's not. We don't have that number. Exactly. But 150 compared to over 2,000 people living in the village.
Yeah. Okay, good. Maccarini was technically the incumbent, but had never been elected. How did that factor into the dynamics of the race, if at all?
Yeah, I actually think it didn't play a huge factor in this race. If anything, I think it helped him. Maccarini, throughout his time on the board, which is a little over 6 months, has been one of the most, if not the most frequent dissenter on the village board. And in many ways, he was more of an outsider than either Perry Allen or Craig Rothstein, which may have hurt him a little bit. He's only been living in the village for 5 years, and he works, as I mentioned, as a full-time attorney in Putnam County. And by his own admission, prior to being appointed to the village board, he wasn't particularly engaged in village politics. So he had a lot to do to make his voice and his position known in the election. And I think he struggled with that. The other factor in this election that hurt him was village trustee Frances Uku, who has also been one of the most frequent dissenters and has been a very outspoken member on the board, decided not to endorse him in this election and instead support the other two candidates. And I think we don't know exactly how much that affected the race, but hearing from some of the voters, it did play a role in their decision. And I think that was a factor in the results.
Okay. So, Athan, all three candidates talked about public trust. What specifically were they pointing to, and why has trust become such a central issue in Red Hook Village right now?
This is such a loaded question because I think so much of the erosion of public trust in the board comes down to communication from the Board of Trustees and the mayor to the public. I'm assuming we'll get more into the wastewater treatment plant issues later on in this conversation, but beyond this, I think residents feel like the board often takes major decisions that affect their lives without taking the time to inform voters about the fact that those decisions are being made and properly explain why those decisions are being taken. And I'll give an example. The board recently, I don't remember if it was in early March or late February, I believe it was late February, they voted to dramatically increase the sewer O&M rates for sewer users.
That means operating and maintenance. Yeah.
Operating and maintenance costs by 110%, a massive jump. And by law, they had to hold a public hearing for that resolution, but there was very little outreach on the part of the mayor and the other village members that, hey, this is happening. Here's why it's happening. You know, they explained it at one of their workshop meetings or board meetings, but there wasn't a concerted effort to go out to voters and explain that to them. And at the public hearing, one resident who had read our story about it in the Daily Catch spoke about her opposition to this rate increase. And then some of the other members who were in attendance at that meeting for another issue and another public hearing heard what she was saying and were motivated to say, what? This is happening? And stood up and spoke against it as well. And I think a lot of them felt like they were blindsided by this particular action. And I think that theme has continued to persist with this current board. And I think to give some credit to the board, they're recognizing that. And they've recently adopted or put out a communication survey to residents saying, how can we communicate better with you? Where do you get most of your information about the village from? And that's been spearheaded by Deputy Mayor Melkorka Carval. Whether it's going to be enough, I don't know. But I do think they're recognizing that they have a communication issue, and the public has made note of that as well.
Very interesting. So we'll see what comes next with that. You mentioned the wastewater treatment plant, Athan. That also came up repeatedly during the campaign. How much did that issue shape voter sentiment, do you think?
Yeah, so I was outside Village Hall talking to voters from noon to 2 p.m. on election day. And I ended up speaking to about 12 people, 8 on the record, and almost all but one of them said the condition of the wastewater treatment plant was a top issue for them in this election. But more than the plant's condition itself, I think it comes back to communication and trust. What's very important to understand is that the current village board inherited a very poorly designed wastewater treatment plant and sewer system. None of the current board members were on the board when those designs were being passed, and that phase one was being voted on and designed. But there were a number of major environmental issues with the plant releasing harmful pollutants into the environment, particularly around the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025. And during this time, I think many residents felt like the village board was not being completely honest with them about the condition of the plant and took too long to properly deal with the issues at hand. And fast forward to today, and as our wonderful colleague Claire Greenberger recently reported, the mayor has continued to downplay the shortcomings of this plant and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation violations of the wastewater treatment plant. Even as the plant as a whole is in better shape, there's still problems that persist, and the mayor has not always been, even today, fully transparent about those problems. So all of this to say, voters clearly want board members who are honest with them about the state of the wastewater treatment plant and the sewer system, particularly as the village moves forward with its plan for the phase 2 expansion. Rothstein and Allen, as we'll touch on very soon, both in theory, support the sewer expansion, but only if it's done in the right way and that the board is very transparent with the public about the problems that it's facing.
Let me ask you very directly, as you suggested I would. I will. How do Allen and Rothstein want to approach this next phase? And maybe before we talk about that, Athan, you can highlight for us what the plan is for that phase two expansion, how much of an expansion it is, why it's necessary, what it's going to do. Remind our listeners about that.
Yes. So broadly speaking, the village has a plan to have a centralized sewer system for the entire village. And that plan has been broken down into three phases. Phase one, which was completed, which we're dealing with now. Phase two, which is planned for some time in the near future, which would expand the wastewater treatment plant capacity fourfold from 75,000 gallons of wastewater to 300,000 gallons of wastewater capacity. And it would add, under the current plan, an additional 171 properties to their centralized sewer system. I think right now it's about 150 properties that are connected to it. So it would add 171, but it would quadruple the capacity of the wastewater treatment plant. And the reason why it's so important for the village to increase its capacity is because the town of Red Hook is relying on that project. The town wants to establish its own sewer district in the T&D district.
Which is south down Broadway, right?
Right.
South of the village.
But in order to do that, part of their plan for the sewer district is to use the village's wastewater treatment plant. And so they need the extra capacity of the village's wastewater treatment plant in order to complete their project. And I know we've spoken about in the past about a number of developments that the town is planning in that T&D district. So a lot is riding on this phase two expansion. While simultaneously, village residents are concerned about the scale of the project, particularly because of all the problems with phase one. And they fear that if it was to malfunction on the scale that it did with phase one in a much larger plant, it would have catastrophic implications for village residents, particularly those who live close to the plant.
So do Allen and Maccarini agree, and do they with one another, and do they agree with where the board is heading on this project, or do we know?
Right. So we distributed to each of them a questionnaire before the election, asking them specifically about the sewer system. I also talked to them individually about this. And interestingly enough, Perry Allen and Tony Maccarini were the most cautious about the phase two expansion in their election campaigns. Both stressed the need to solve issues with the current system before proceeding with phase two. And Maccarini even went so far to say he would support a moratorium on phase two if the current problems of the phase one system are not properly addressed. And Allen stressed a similar sentiment. You know, he said we can't even talk about phase two until we solve the problems of phase one. Rothstein does support the phase two sewer system, but like the other two candidates, he only wants to move forward with the project if he can be sure that the problems of phase one are not repeated. And he had a lovely exchange that I'll share that I was present for with a voter about this very question on election day. He was walking in to vote, and a voter said, "How could you support the expansion of the sewer system?" And he said, "Well, I support it in theory, but only if there's guidelines in place to ensure the same environmental disasters aren't repeated." And the voter said, "Well, how come you didn't say that in your survey?" He was like, "Well, I should have done that, and my bad for not communicating my position clearly." And they had a back and forth about that. And eventually she became a little bit more understanding of his position. But he has stressed in conversations with me that, again, he does support the project and believes it's necessary to account for the village's growth and expansion.
So, Athan, zooming out now to governance, how might this election shift the power dynamics on the board, particularly in relation to Mayor Karen Smythe and her deputy, whom you've mentioned, Malcorka Chiarval, and also Frances Uku, who you've told us has been, well, she not only endorsed the winning candidates, but she's also been a bit of a dissenter herself. So give us a top line summary, not too much, but a top line summary of where we're headed here.
Right. And this is a very exciting question, but it's also very difficult to answer right now. And so, to clarify, we're speculating about the future of the board because we don't know until it actually takes place. But as you mentioned, Uku was the only trustee to endorse a candidate, and she took a very keen interest in this election. She seems to be very optimistic that Allen and Craig Rothstein will be her allies on the board. Uku has differed from the mayor and deputy mayor on a number of issues and has criticized the quote unquote top-down manner in which the mayor has operated the board. She wants the other board members to be active, to have lively conversations on the board about resolutions rather than people just blindly supporting the mayor's resolutions she presents. And to be fair, I think some of that has happened as of late. But she's hoping that with Allen and Rothstein and her, that sentiment will be in a majority, right? Because this is a 5-person board, and you only need 3 votes for a majority decision. And thus far, since April 2025, Deputy Mayor Malcorka Chiarval and Trustee Amy Smith have tended to vote in lockstep with the Mayor Karen Smythe. And that could very well, that will stay the same. I fully expected the Deputy Mayor to vote in tandem with the Mayor. They seem to be aligned on a lot of key policy and procedural decisions. But the big thing is now that it's only 2 of them, and that quote unquote opposition, if you want to say it, if you want to characterize it like that, could potentially have a lot more power to pass resolutions and to enact procedural changes without the support of both the mayor and the deputy mayor. And it's going to be really interesting to see how the mayor and the deputy mayor, being more senior in their positions, respond to a situation where potentially they're in the minority and they have much less power than the other board members. And I think that's the main thing that is going to be key to watch going forward.
And we'll be there. We'll be covering it. You'll be covering it. We'll be talking about it on the podcast, and we'll have lots of stories. So a couple final questions for you. What are the immediate challenges these trustees will face as they step into these 1-year terms?
Yeah, so that's another very difficult question. The 2 big projects that the village is undertaking, and we've talked about one of these, is the 2 big projects are the phase 2 sewer expansion and the creation of a new zoning district in the village's northeast quadrant that will pave the way for the WUPCO affordable housing development, as well as other commercial and housing development in that area. Beyond this, I think we can say that regaining the public trust in the board will be the biggest task these new board members immediately face. As we've talked about previously, both candidates, particularly Allen, campaigned on dramatically changing the board's relationship with the public. And it's much easier to say that that's what you're going to do when you are campaigning and before you've got into office. But once they're in that new position, it's going to be difficult, I think, for them to change the perception of the board. Because as we've mentioned, there's a negative connotation of the current board around among many residents. And so being on the board and a part of that entity, they're going to have to work hard to flip that. And that's going to be a big challenge. The other thing I'll say is, and this is something that Rothstein has repeated over and over again to conversations with me, the sewer expansion, the rezoning, a lot of these issues are very complex and dense. And there's a lot of new information that they're going to have to learn and process relatively quickly. And that's going to be a challenge in and of itself for these new board members. Rothstein was exclaiming, he was talking to me about how he's feeling a little bit overwhelmed of how much information he's going to have to study and learn to prepare to make decisions on these very important issues. And I think, as I've just said, that alone is going to be a challenge for them.
Perfect. I don't think I'd want to do it all. And I'm glad you'll be doing it all for us.
Well, I'm not making decisions, but I am
But you are learning it. You are learning.
Yes.
Yeah. So finally, we told our listeners we'd talk very briefly at the end of the show about the zoning study. So the board this week approved a study focused on this Northeast quadrant you've been alluding to. Just briefly, Athan, what is that study about and why does it matter for residents and the future of the village?
Yeah, so I want to start by saying that this Monday was the last board meeting with the current board setup. So at the end, Mayor Smythe said a farewell to Amy Smith and Anthony Maccarini. And why do I bring it up in this context? Well, we talked about before how Amy Smith and Malcorka Kjarval tend to vote with the mayor. And this zoning study was passed 3-2 on the last village board meeting in this current configuration, with Tony Maccarini and Frances Uku voting against it, and Amy Smith, Malcorka Kjarval, and the mayor casting the deciding vote to adopt this zoning study. And so it was almost a poetic ending to this board's term to have a 3-2 vote with Amy, Malcorka, and Mayor Karen Smythe, and Maccarini and Uku dissenting. So that's the first thing I want to say about it. It was a very poetic ending to this village's organizational term. Now, about the study itself is going to have very little immediate impact on village residents. The vote to adopt it was to adopt this zoning study as an amendment to the village's comprehensive plan, which was last completed, if you can believe it, in 1968. And the purpose of this zoning study was to allow them to create that new zoning district in the village's northeast quadrant, which will be called Gateway North. And so the next step of this process is to actually adopt the zoning amendment. And that's going to be the task of the new board members. And that will have actual immediate and binding impact on village residents. Now, the study itself was pretty widespread and wide-reaching, and it laid out a series of goals and ambitions for that North Broadway part of the village. Among them is allowing a diverse mix of residential and non-residential uses, allowing commercial uses to continue, and allow for the expansion of additional commercial uses on the east side of North Broadway to maintain the village's historical characteristics, to allow for the RUPCO development, the RUPCO affordable housing development to take place. But again, I just want to emphasize so that our listeners are not confused, this is not allowing or changing anything in the zoning of the village itself. That has to be done by a zoning amendment. But in order to adopt the zoning amendment, you needed to have an amendment to the comp plan. And so that is why they did that. But the implications of this will be spelled out in the zoning amendment, which will come in the next organizational year and will come to these two new board members.
Got it. Okay, well, thank you. Well, Athan, I'm so glad you joined us. We're so glad that your debut is now complete. It's history, and we can't wait to welcome you back to the catch up. So thanks again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here, and I hope to be back soon.
And as we wrap up, a big thank you as well to our sponsor, Hudson Solar and Battery Solutions. If you've been thinking about solar, especially after the last big power outages we've had, now's a good time to explore your options. Visit hudsonsolarsolutions.com for more information. And that concludes this episode of The Catch Up. Thanks to Maddie Rosenberg, Jen Hammoud, and Esther Martell at our partner, Radio Free Rhinecliff, for their help in producing this episode. We'll see you next time.